Welcome to Novara Live. I'm Michael Walker, and I'm joined on this heatwave day by Helena, aka No Justice MTG. How are you doing?
Pretty good. It's my birthday yesterday, so I'm full of Nando's today after spending time with some family, and then a lovely walk through a nature reserve. So I'm in good spirits and looking forward to the show.
Oh, lovely. Happy birthday from me, and I can assume from all of our audience as well. Let's get a happy birthday in the chat. Coming up later tonight, the race to become the next leader of the Conservative Party has really kicked off. The candidate list has been finalised today. Also, tensions have been heightened between Israel and Lebanon after airstrikes hit the Golan Heights at the weekend. Very much disputed who is responsible for those airstrikes. First, though, revelations about Britain's fiscal black hole. Chancellor of the Exchequer, Rachel Reeves, has made a dramatic statement in the Commons this afternoon, announcing spending cuts and paving the way for tax hikes in the autumn budget. The reason? She says she's discovered a hitherto unknown hole in the country's budget.
Mr. Speaker, the government published its plans for day-to-day spending in the spring budget in March. But when I arrived at the Treasury on the very first day, I was alerted by officials that this was not how much the previous government expected to spend this year. It wasn't even close. In fact, the total pressures on these budgets across a range of areas was an additional £35 billion. Once you account for the slippage in budgets you usually see over a year and the reserve of £9 billion designed to respond to genuinely unexpected events, it means, Mr. Speaker, that we have inherited a projected overspend of £22 billion.
It looks a bit like political theatre, but she's good at it, isn't she, Rachel Reeves? It does feel like she's genuinely incredibly furious that she's done the sums and they don't quite add up. Reeves blamed the black hole, or so-called black hole, on various departmental overspends and uncosted pledges by her Tory predecessors. So of particular note was an overspend of £6.5 billion on the asylum system. She also pointed out a further £1.5 billion shortfall resulting from compensation paid to rail companies during the pandemic, which hadn't been accounted for, and support for Ukraine, which had not been properly funded. That was also cited by the Chancellor. Rachel Reeves also accused the Tories of ignoring the independent pay review bodies when it came to public service pay rises and pledged to implement their recommendations. And she said this would cost a further £9 billion, which wasn't in the costings done by the Tories. So how would Reeves fill this financial black hole? Well, one way was to simply drop uncosted pledges from her predecessors.
At Conservative Party conference last year, the former Prime Minister announced the introduction of a new qualification, the Advanced British Standard. That is a commitment costing nearly £200 million next year, rising to billions across future years. Mr. Speaker, this was supposed to be the former Prime Minister's legacy. But it turns out he didn't put aside a single penny to pay for it. So we will not go ahead with that policy because if we cannot afford it, we cannot do it.
If we cannot afford it, we cannot do it. Now, John Maynard Keynes very famously said, if we can do it, we can afford it. Right? So this was sort of his idea that money is to some degree, a social construct. We can afford to do what we can do. Labour have sort of turned that around. If we don't have the money, it cannot happen. It simply cannot happen. Other policies to be scrapped include aspects of the Tories' asylum system, levelling up, and transport policies. But the speech wasn't only about cancelling Tory plans, and Reeves also pledged spending cuts that will immediately impact key sections of the electorate.
Mr. Speaker, the scale of the situation we are dealing with means incredibly tough choices. I repeat today the commitment that we made in our manifesto to protect the triple lock. But today I am making the difficult decision that those not in receipt of pension credit or certain other means-tested benefits will no longer receive the winter fuel payment from this year onwards.
So the winter fuel payment is currently a figure of £100 to £300, a sort of one-off payment that older people get in the winter to pay their bills. That's going to be made means-tested. It was universal. And Rachel Reeves says that will cost the government £1.5 billion. Reeves also warned we can expect further measures to reduce the deficit in her first budget this autumn.
This is the beginning of a process, not the end. I am announcing today that I will hold a budget on October the 30th, alongside a full economic and fiscal forecast from the Office for Budget Responsibility. I have to tell the House that the budget will involve taking difficult decisions to meet our fiscal rules across spending, welfare and tax. Mr. Speaker, they still don't get it today. Parties in Downing Street crushing the economy, gambling on the election, party before country every single time.
Reeves went on to reaffirm that Labour would stick to its commitment to not raise income tax, national insurance or VAT, so presumably any tax hike will come from elsewhere. And on the spending side, Reeves gave this hint about where future cuts could come from.
I will look closely at our welfare system because if you can work, you should work. That is a principle of this government. Yet under the previous government, welfare spending ballooned while inactivity has risen sharply in recent years. So we will ensure that the welfare system is focused on supporting people into employment. And we will assess the unacceptable levels of fraud and error in our welfare system.
I think lots of people may remember sort of the New Labour years and then the Tory years where there was this huge sort of moral panic about benefit scroungers and also benefit fraudsters. And I remember sort of seeing posters around town sort of telling you to rat on your neighbours if you suspected that they might be committing benefit fraud. So I wonder if we're going to get a sort of similar narrative from this Labour government. I found it pretty toxic the first time around. I imagine it would be again this time. Of course, though, the major target of Rachel Reeves' scorn wasn't people on benefits. It was former Chancellor Jeremy Hunt, and he got a chance to respond.
Today, she will fool absolutely no one with a shameless attempt to lay the grounds for tax rises she didn't have the courage to tell us about. She says, Mr. Speaker, the information is new. But she herself told the Financial Times, you don't need to win an election to find out the state of public finances, as we've got the OBR now. Paul Johnson of the IFS says the state of public finances were apparent pre-election to anyone who cared to look, which is why he and other independent figures say her argument is not credible and won't wash. Those public finances were audited by the OBR just 10 weeks before the election was called. We're now expected to believe that in that short period, a £20 billion black hole has magically emerged. But every single day in that period, in fact, since January, in line with constitutional convention, she has had privileged access to the Treasury Permanent Secretary. She could find out absolutely anything she needed. So will she confirm today to the House she did have meetings with the Permanent Secretary of the Treasury before the election? Will she tell the House if they discussed public finances? Will she tell the House if they discussed any of the pressures she's talking about today? And if so, why are we only hearing today what she wants to do about them? That's why today's exercise is not economic, it's political.
I'm joined now by Jonathan Portes, Professor of Economics and Public Policy at King's College London and a former Chief Economist at the Cabinet Office. Thank you so much for joining us. To begin with, I mean, you've been at sort of in very senior positions in the civil service. Who's right here when it comes to what Rachel Reeves should have and shouldn't have known before this election? Sort of, is this just a political ploy? She could have found out about this fiscal black hole before the election, but decided not to mention it for political reasons.
It's a political ploy, and she did know that the public spending plans that she by and large signed up to before the election were not realistic. And a number of us, including, as you said, the IFS, did say that in advance. But, and this is very important, I think she is genuinely shocked, and I think she's genuinely right to be shocked at, just beyond the pressures which were evident from outside, some of the unfunded spending commitments and degree of financial mismanagement that has been revealed today. In particular, the more than $6 billion overspend on asylum, the Rwanda plan, and asylum seeker accommodation. Nobody knew about that. And Jeremy Hunt simply lying when he says that the OBR audited that. That is not what the OBR does. It does not have a remit to audit public spending in that way. Indeed, the chairman of the OBR a few months ago complained that the spending plans that he was obliged to put in his projections were worse than fiction because he didn't have the detail. He didn't have the remit to say that what the government was planning was unrealistic. And he certainly does not have either the power or the staff to send in auditors to the Home Office or wherever else to find out what the real state of spending was. So I and many others did criticize Reeves and Labour during the election campaign for not being for dodging the question of how she was going to make this sort of implicit tax and spending plans that she was signed up to add up. But equally, I think she is absolutely right to do what she's done today. And while it is, of course, a political ploy, it's an entirely justifiable one. The previous government did leave a huge secret black hole in the public finances, and they should rightly be held to account for it.
Potentially the confusing part is that the numbers are so similar, right? So the Institute for Fiscal Studies said there's a £20 billion black hole. Then Labour get into power and they say, whoa, there's this surprising £22 billion black hole. So it looks like the same black hole. But I suppose it is the difference that the one the IFS was talking about, so the Institute for Fiscal Studies, that was kind of more of a long-term thing based on all the costings the OBR had. And now this is sort of Labour saying this is overspends that they hadn't even really written down. They hadn't told the OBR about these. This is separate. And is this maybe a bit more short-term, whereas what the IFS was talking about was a bit more long-term? I'm just trying to make sense of sort of where these two different numbers came from.
Exactly. So the 22 billion, Reeves' 22 billion, is a more or less a real number. It's how much more the government is going to spend this year on current projections and plans than was published at the time the OBR last published the public finance projections. So it's pretty simple. 22 billion extra this year that we didn't know about. Now, some of that, as the IFS have said and others have said, we arguably could and should have known about, but it's not the same as the supposed 20 billion black hole over, which, as you say, is a sort of longer term thing. It is much fuzzier because it's according to certain definitions of the fiscal rules. It's a projection in 5 years' time and so on. It's really the difference between me saying, oh God, I have to spend £20 billion this year on fixing up my house that I didn't know, and having carefully budgeted for it, I don't have the money, and saying, well, in 5 years, projecting forward what my mortgage payment might be, assuming my pay growth and what interest rates might be, then I might be £20 billion short then in 5 years' time, or then again, it might not, depending on various other things. So they are completely different concepts. But the £22 billion that we're talking about today is actually a pretty short term, and it's a pretty real number.
It's short term and it's real. It's not just projections. But I mean, this is a government of a major country which is solvent. So she does presumably have the option of saying, well, there's this overspend of £22 billion, but don't worry, we can just borrow it from the financial markets. That would be an option, right? And so there is a sort of political choice to say we have to make really tough decisions, which will include cuts here and then some tax rises there. Is that a correct sort of understanding?
We could, but I think actually it's not, borrowing it is not really a sensible option. I think, when we'll get onto this in terms of the medium to long term, where I think lots of us think that we should be and prepared to borrow, possibly borrow significantly more for productive investment, for things that will deliver growth and improved outcomes over the long term. But I do think it's a lot less sensible for any chancellor to go to the to go out to the public in the financial market to say, sorry, due to incompetence and financial mismanagement, there's actually an extra £20 billion of spending this year, but don't worry, I'm just going to borrow it. That is not actually a sensible way to run the public finances. And it's the difference between the government's two fiscal rules. The first fiscal rule, which is to balance the current budget to ensure that spending and tax are broadly balanced in the short term, which most economists agree is a perfectly sensible rule and is Reeves' first rule. And to do that means that you can't just go out and borrow extra to finance current spending. Now, the longer term, the debt rule, the second fiscal rule, which applies over the longer term, 5 years, that is a much fuzzier concept and one where many of us have many more problems with that. But adjusting that wouldn't solve this particular problem.
When it comes to sort of that capital spend, which, as you say, relates to the other fiscal rule, which is debt falling as a percentage of GDP within 5 years, all sounds a little bit arbitrary, doesn't it? It does seem that Labour have today been talking about infrastructure projects that will be cancelled. So I suppose ones that, I'm not sure if many of our audience will be that fussed about the underpass that was going to go under Stonehenge. One which is a lot more emotive is HS2. And it wasn't announced in this speech, but sort of there's been discussions that Labour might, make it even shorter than it was going to be under the Conservatives. Do you think that there is a danger that Labour got elected saying we're going to get Britain building, and now they're going to say, oh, actually, we can't afford it, so therefore let's put up all of this capital investment that we kind of implied we might do it, but we can't afford to do it because, as Rachel Reeves said, if we can't afford it, we can't do it. It's not possible.
There is a real danger. And I think you were absolutely right in contrasting what Reeves said with what Keynes said, which is that if we can do it, we can afford it. It was that sort of anti-Keynesianism that led to some of the most damaging aspects of austerity in the early 2010s, which we know in the medium to long term has actually made us worse off, not just in social terms, but also in economic and fiscal terms, right? We know, for example, that Osborne's cancellation of Sure Start has actually cost us money over the long term. We know that some of those investments in public infrastructure that could have been made in the early 2010s would mean that we'd be more prosperous and our fiscal position would be better today. So I think there is a real danger today. I don't think any of the announcements today, by and large, they seem actually perfectly justifiable. As you say, I think, I'm not an expert on the Stonehenge tunnel, but clearly, lots of people think it wasn't a particularly good use of public money. It had some other problems with it, and that cancelling it is probably a defensible decision. I think the real test will be in the autumn whether she does stick with the sort of anti-Keynesian, if we can't afford it, we're not going to do it, or whether she says, actually, you need to invest to grow just as much as you need to grow to spend. We are actually going to ensure that we make the investment we need to ensure we have that growth and that we will get Britain building and all the rest of it. So I don't think that what was announced today in substantive terms is necessarily bad from that point of view, but some of the rhetoric is a bit troubling, and I hope it will be turned around before we get to the actual decisions on this.
Someone who I think many of the audience are going to think I'm being hopelessly naive now, but I'm just going to put it forward, even if I don't necessarily believe it. But if you were being very hopeful about this Labour government, you could say, actually, today's news day could have been kind of left-wing coded. They've made a deal with the doctors. They're getting a 22% pay rise. They're accepting the independent public pay review body's sort of suggestion that public sector workers should get 5.5% pay increases. So this could be a sort of like, we've got into power, we're doing left-wing things, but they've decided for political reason they actually want to do those things very quietly and scream about doing right-wing things. Do you think there is a possibility that they're still trying to sort of present themselves as more right-wing than they actually are?
I mean, they're certainly trying to present themselves as fiscally conservative. And as I said, I think that is actually justifiable in terms of today's announcement, but poses some real risks over the medium term. We just don't know what will happen. I would say that in a lot of today, it's partly, as we discussed earlier, a political ploy, a justified political ploy, but a political ploy. It's partly just a recognition of reality. So, for example, I don't think the main reason for accepting the pay review body recommendations is that it's pressure from the unions or from strikes. It's simply a recognition that if you don't pay people something related to what they can get elsewhere, they're going to vote with their feet. And it's politically disastrous for any government to let teachers and doctors and nurses walk out the door and go and get less demanding and equally or better paid jobs elsewhere. You just can't. So I think that doing that is it's the right thing to do, and maybe you can describe it. It will be welcomed by the public sector unions and by workers, but it's also just a recognition of reality, quite frankly.
Nominations have closed to be the next leader of the Conservative Party and next leader of the opposition. And 6 candidates have got the required nominations. Let's take a look at them. The bookies' favourite is former Business Secretary Kemi Badenoch, who launched her bid this weekend. In a Sunday Times opinion piece, she railed against what she called a nasty identity politics that seeks to divide. And she said the Tories should celebrate capitalism more vigorously. Robert Jenrick is currently the second favourite to win the leadership. He was most recently immigration minister under Sunak's government, but resigned because he didn't think the Rwanda plan was tough enough. In 2021, he was forced to resign as a housing minister after approving a £1 billion development by a pornographer he'd sat next to at a fundraising do. Tom Tugendhat has also entered the competition and is seen as a standard bearer for the ever-shrinking liberal wing of the Tory party, though even he has talked tough on immigration, saying he would leave the European Convention on Human Rights if it were necessary to secure Britain's borders. Like Tugendhat, James Cleverly is also a former soldier and is the most senior member of the shadow cabinet to be going for the top job. Cleverly was Sunak's final Home Secretary and is currently the shadow Home Secretary. Another previous Home Secretary going for the top job is Priti Patel. She was a key ally of Boris Johnson, who stood by her even after an independent investigation found she had bullied her staff. And the outsider candidate in the race is the former Work and Pension Secretary, Mel Stride. If you don't know much about Mel Stride, don't worry, because all of these characters we're going to hear from a lot over the next few months. And that's because this contest will be going on until the 2nd of November, just over 3 months away. Helena, are you glad this is going to be going on quite so long? We got 3 months of this to look forward to.
Absolutely. I mean, it seems a very long time for them to choose a leader, but I guess they know that they're in the wilderness for a very long time, and the decision that they have to choose who becomes leader is going to be incredibly impactful, whether or not they can somehow claw back where they are electorally over the next 5 years, or indeed look so ridiculous that they push themselves further into irrelevancy. So taking their time on this particular issue to ensure that they maximize electoral outcomes, I guess that makes some amount of sense, although what it also does is allow them to infight for too long and make themselves even less unified as an opposition, which of course we all know on the left here, that doesn't lead to many electoral successes in the long run. As for the candidates who've put themselves forward so far, what we really have is a case of the good, the bad, and the totally batshit insane. So in the kind of the good camp, you've got James Cleverly and Tom Tugendhat, the kind of more centrist, closer to this kind of the centre-right versions of the Conservative Party MPs here, who broadly want to see themselves just as being a competent force to try and combat the Labour Party on their own platforms rather than try and push some kind of like move towards something more reactionary in terms of what the Conservative Party looks like. I know that Tom Tugendhat has kind of pivoted to talking about the European Convention on Human Rights, for example, but for me, I actually think that what he's doing there is just essentially doing something performative for the membership, like Penny Mordaunt was doing on her U-turn over trans people at the last time there was an election, rather than doing something that he genuinely believes in. No true One Nation Tory will want to so viciously attack something that is kind of a stalwart of Churchill's history in terms of geopolitics with regards to Europe. In the bad column, you've got Robert Jenrick, not only the man who had the whole painting over a mural for children, which makes him really look just genuinely kind of evil, really and truly, but also indeed somebody who helped approve against advice planning commission for a Conservative Party donor worth millions and millions of pounds. So he's someone who's got a track record of not being really in the public's good books. And there's also Mel Stride as well, who in his position as in the DWP was the person who oversaw this ridiculous kind of attack on people who are disabled, saying, not really disabled. And what we'll do, we'll stop giving them sick notes from actual medical professionals, but we'll subcontract that out to, I don't know, Capita or something to try and do independent assessments, i.e. just to try and judge them as being fit for work when they're not, which didn't really go down too well with many people, even in this kind of anti-welfare blitz of kind of media round that we've seen so far. But the last category is the dangerous one for the Conservatives, and that is Kemi Badenoch and Priti Patel, who are absolutely, they're totally batshit insane, really, at this point. Let's be real. Kemi, obviously more so. Patel, she's been putting down tracks with the Conservative Democratic Organisation, and for me, I actually think Patel is the favourite because of the kind of ways in which the whilst on the backbench she's been trying to woo the membership at all of these little kind of events at conferences by trying to reach the base about the failure of democracy and carry the torch of Boris Johnson, whereas Kemi Badenoch has too much kind of connection to the administration who lost the election. And on top of that, she's just weird, right? She's just a bit weird and just belligerent and kind of petulant like a child in the Commons, and that's not a good look. So if they do choose Kemi, who is the front runner, I think that's somebody who's definitely the accelerationist candidate. That if the Tories really want to speed themselves into irrelevancy, picking someone who's not very good on camera, not very good at putting her points across, but plays very heavily into the Conservative base, probably is the one who they probably will pick outside of Patel, but probably isn't the best for the Conservative Party's electoral chances moving forward.
I mean, she doesn't really focus on things that I think you kind of ordinary man in the street really cares about, because she talks a lot about like identity politics, cancel culture, like lots of stuff that, campus politics essentially, which, I think the Labour Party will be licking their lips if that's who they're sort of up against every Wednesday. Someone who isn't standing to be Tory leader is Suella Braverman. She has complained in the Telegraph. She's been branded mad, bad, and dangerous by her own party, and so won't lead it. Of course, some people have been branded bad, mad, and dangerous by their own party and decided that they still are fit to lead it. Jeremy Corbyn was one of those. So many Labour MPs called him all of those things. Maybe he's just tougher than Suella Braverman. Helena, are you surprised that Braverman has decided not to stand? Some people suggesting she could go over to Reform. Obviously there's not a spot to be leader of Reform because Nigel Farage has got it, but will we still be hearing a lot from her over the next few years, I suppose?
But I'm not surprised that she couldn't really gather support amongst, especially the Parliamentary Conservative Party, who she seems to have a vendetta against ever since that she was removed from her position as Home Secretary. She tends to make a lot of enemies. And we'll certainly be hearing from her, though. Like, it's clear that she sees her future in terms of her political career by pandering to special interest groups outside of Parliament, rather than being kind of somebody who'd be a mainstay of the Conservative Party's kind of forefront in their terms of their branding moving forward. We saw her going and speaking at the American Enterprise Institute, give a little jaunts to Israel to try and grift off of that culture war as well. And I think it's super out of touch. It was just the same with Kemi Badenoch. This isn't what normal people care about. In fact, it makes them seem incredibly out of touch when she's banging on about gender ideology and cultural Marxism in the press, which goes right down really well with the kind of myopic idiots who read the Telegraph. But in terms of people normal on the street, like, saying that the Conservative Party lost the election because they were too right wing and were caught up in not being hard enough on trans people, that's literally the opposite. They were elected in 2019 on a platform of building all of these hospitals, the green industrial revolution, of uprating benefits in line with inflation, completing HS2, all of these kind of interventionist, kind of more kind of liberal political policies. Even like a ban on conversion therapy was a Boris Johnson manifesto commitment, and then they just changed leader and scrapped it completely. If anything, right, focusing on the culture wars is what made them look completely out of touch, when they should have been focusing on bread and butter issues like the cost of living crisis, like the NHS and the state of the public realm. So, I'm sure Braverman will try and be sniping from the sidelines, and if she doesn't essentially have enough of a platform in the Tories, I think the potential move to Reform is definitely on the cards, because although she'll probably have a bit of a clash of egos with Nigel Farage, she'll certainly be far more of a political firebrand as an iconoclast outside of the political class, rather than trying to do it from within.
I assume she's going to be looking for some spots on GB News, and GB News, one of their commentators, called her a racist last Saturday, and GB News have put out a statement sort of saying that was completely unacceptable for someone to say that on our channel. It's supposed to be the home of free speech. If you call Suella Braverman a racist, you're going to get sort of denounced on Twitter, which by the organisation, which is essentially what seems to have happened there. A missile strike on the town of Majd al-Shams in the Israeli-occupied Golan Heights has killed 12 people, with at least 10 of them children. That was the moment a missile struck a football field in the predominantly Arab Druze-populated town on Saturday. According to locals, the missile detonated where children gathered to rest, play, and take drinks of water between football matches. 44 people were also injured in the strike. Thousands of people gathered in the town on Sunday to bury the bodies of those killed. Mourners wept as caskets were carried through the crowds, with one telling AFP, "Our community is very close-knit. These children are like children of everybody in the village." There was anger on display too when Israel's far-right finance minister Bezalel Smotrich turned up in Majd al-Shams. "You son of bitch, you criminal, you murderer," local residents yelled, soon forcing Smotrich to leave. It's not yet clear who is responsible for the missile that hit the sports field, though Israel has blamed Hezbollah. That message was backed up by US Secretary of State Antony Blinken, who said this.
Let me say that we are deeply saddened by the loss of life that we saw. There is no justification for terrorism, period. And every indication is that indeed the rockets were the rocket was from Hezbollah. We stand by Israel's right to defend its citizens from terrorist attacks.
However, Hezbollah has denied all responsibility for the attack. That's unusual for the group, which usually studiously claims missile strikes inside Israel and its occupied territories. And in an interview with Sky News, Lebanon's foreign minister, Abdallah Abu Habib, said this.
Golan is Syrian, occupied by Israel, and therefore it's not self-defense. And therefore, it doesn't mean give them a license to kill and destroy like they took in Gaza. This is not, it shouldn't be. The world should not give them a license to kill. The people who were killed were not Israelis. They were Syrians. And there is no way that I don't know who did it. And we ask for an investigation, UN investigation. There is ANTSO, there is UNIFIL, there is all of these. They can do investigation, and we're ready to accept the result. So we don't know who did it. I know Hezbollah is accused by Israel that they did it. Hezbollah refuses. My feeling is that why would Hezbollah do it to kill Arabs, to kill Syrians? And Hezbollah has been, always targeting military positions of Israel, not civilians. The number of civilians killed in Israel were less than 7, while in Lebanon over more than 100 killed by Israel in Lebanon. So I cannot understand why would Hezbollah do it.
That call for an independent investigation has been backed up by the European Union Foreign Affairs Chief Josep Borrell, and Axios has a report on the US response. So they say this. On Saturday, President Biden's senior advisor, Amos Hochstein, spoke to Israel's Minister of Defense, Yoav Gallant, and told him Israel has the right to defend itself against Hezbollah, but must avoid an all-out escalation and minimize civilian casualties, an Israeli official said. The Israeli official said Hochstein expressed concern that if the IDF strikes Beirut, Hezbollah would respond by firing long-range missiles at Israel, which would likely lead to even further escalation. We definitely think an IDF strike on Beirut is a potential red line for Hezbollah, a US official said. Despite international fears, Israel has wasted no time preparing a response. Israel's Security Cabinet has authorized Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to order the military to retaliate against the armed group based in southern Lebanon. In a statement, Netanyahu said, "The state of Israel will not and cannot let this pass. Our response will come, and it will be harsh." This morning, that response began. Israeli drones have struck targets deep inside Lebanon, with 2 people so far reported to have been killed. And countries around the world have reacted to the risk of increased hostilities between Israel and Lebanon. The US has told its citizens in Lebanon to prepare crisis plans. Meanwhile, 11 countries, including France and the UK, have advised against all travel to Lebanon, and Germany has urged its citizens to leave Lebanon immediately. Cyprus has also said that it is on standby to assist with the evacuation of foreign nationals. Multiple international airlines have cancelled flights to Beirut as the region appears to teeter on a knife edge. I'm joined now by Trita Parsi, Executive Vice President of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statescraft. Trita, it seems like lots of confusion about what actually happened on the weekend and who was responsible. Can you shed any sort of light on this? Do you have any understanding? Do we sort of have any understanding of what did happen? Who was responsible for this strike?
We really don't, which is why, it's not necessarily particularly positive to see that the US government, the NSC now twice has gone out with statements that not only definitively put the burden and the responsibility at the feet of Hezbollah, but also calls the area attacked northern Israel, when it in reality is occupied Golan Heights. It shows a continuity of the Biden administration with that of the Trump administration, because it was the Trump administration that, as part of the Abraham Accords, recognized Israel's occupation of the Golan Heights. And this is not something that the Biden administration has broken with. And that was made further clear in these statements in which twice they called it northern Israel rather than the occupied Golan Heights. Now, so we don't know enough about it, and I think it's fascinating that the Europeans, Borrell, asked for an independent investigation. This is either, I think, because they are skeptical that Hezbollah is behind it, or they actually do believe that there's a decent likelihood that Hezbollah is behind it, and they want to win some time in order to be able to de-escalate. Because it really lies in the interest of Europe and the United States, as well as many other parties in the region, to make sure that this does not escalate into a larger war, because it would be devastating and it would very likely drag the US into it as well.
And I mean, how does this compare to other sort of previous flashpoints or moments in this conflict? Because I feel like there has been so often discussion about a potential, all-out war that's about to break out between Israel and Lebanon. Obviously, it's been many, many months since October. It hasn't happened yet. Could we not sort of interpret or intuit from the fact that it hasn't happened that no one actually really wants it? If Hezbollah and Israel really wanted to go to war, wouldn't they have done it by now?
We have to first recognize that we've been quite lucky, because there's been several moments in which they were quite close, and this is clearly one of them. I think you are quite right in pointing out that there's plenty of entities that do not want to go into this war. I wouldn't include Israel in that category, however. It's quite clear to me that the Hezbollah doesn't want to have a war, but although Hezbollah has ratcheted up its own low-scale war with Israel since October 7th. But, and this is an important data point that should be included in every media reporting about this, 83% of all missiles or projectiles that have been fired and exchanged since October 7th on the northern border of Israel have come from Israel, not from Lebanon. So Lebanon is or Hezbollah is responding with roughly 17%, whereas Israel is accounting for 83% of the rockets. The US government knew that already after October 7th, the Israelis were planning for a war with Hezbollah. The argument, the narrative that took hold in Israel and is still holding quite strong, is that if Hamas could pull off an attack of this kind, then imagine what Hezbollah could do, mindful of the fact that Hezbollah is much, much stronger. And since Israel essentially failed in terms of preventing October 7th, it would be intolerable for them to live next to Hezbollah and constantly be at risk of Hezbollah striking in a manner of October 7th. This is the narrative that has taken hold, and as a result, there has been a steady push on the Israeli side to expand the war into Hezbollah, into Lebanese territory. Part of the reason why they haven't is actually because there has been behind-the-scenes pressure from the United States for Israel not to do this. And part of how the American side gets away, or Biden, his strategy of getting away with putting pressure on Israel, is that publicly the US side keeps on blaming Hezbollah and Hamas for everything that happens. No criticism of Israel publicly, but behind the scenes there has been criticism and pressure as well. We saw that also very clearly in the exchange of fire between Iran and Israel, in which US pressure on Israel actually was quite decisive. Now, at the same time, I think we should recognize, however, that given the fact that the US pressure has been helpful in preventing a war with Lebanon, that tells you something about the existence of American leverage. And that raises then the question, why hasn't that leverage been used to make sure that the war in Gaza has ended? The US could have used that same leverage to pressure Israel to end the war. It has not. And if you actually want to really reduce the risk of a war between Israel and Hezbollah, the best and fastest way of doing so is to get a ceasefire in Gaza. It's also helpful towards making sure that Houthi attacks and Syrian and Iraqi militia attacks against US troops, and all of it is tied into a ceasefire in Gaza. So thankful that the Biden administration has put pressure to make sure that the Israelis don't go and invade Lebanon, at least thus far, but they could have done even more and much more effectively achieve the same objective by actually getting a ceasefire. And that would also, of course, have prevented a genocide. So while one can be thankful for that they have stopped that, one nevertheless has to recognize that there's a huge failure on the American side of not having used that leverage to prevent the war and stop the war in Gaza.
You've talked about the interest that Israel might have in escalation. They see sort of southern Lebanon as sort of comparable to Gaza before October the 7th. they think they have to sort of destroy any enemies on their borders in case an attack like that happens. I mean, would Israel have the capacity to fight a war both against Hamas in Gaza and against Hezbollah? Presumably sort of escalation and a broadening out of the war would come with risks.
It certainly would. And I'm hearing different opinions on this, but I think one thing that is quite clear to Israel is that if there is a war with Lebanon, mindful of the fact that the tremendous capacity that Hezbollah has in comparison to Hamas, and mindful of the fact that that war very likely could drag the Iranians into the war as well, the Israelis are not counting on their own capacity alone, but they're counting on the US stepping in. Remember that the United States, the UK, France, and Italy also played quite a role in shooting down the Iranian missiles that were shot in April after the Israelis bombed the Iranian consular section of their embassy in Damascus. So the Israelis are, for a very long time, the Netanyahu government has sought some sort of a conflict in the region that would drag the US into it, because US military power can be much, much more helpful to the Israelis in establishing a balance in the region that is much more beneficial to the Israelis, a balance that the Israelis cannot achieve through their own military might. But a war that drags the US into it can. And it's not as if the Netanyahu government has not been pushing the US to go to war with Iran for more than 20 years now. So I wouldn't want to give the Netanyahu government today the benefit of the doubt on these things. It is true that their own capacity may not be sufficient to be able to defeat Hezbollah, but their calculation is that they will manage to drag the US into that war and do it that way.
And presumably that context means the fact of the American presidential election happening in November can't be sort of detached from the strategies of various sides here. I mean, you talked earlier about Joe Biden calling the Golan Heights part of northern Israel and sort of immediately blaming Hezbollah. I want to get up a quote from Phil Gordon. He's the national security advisor to Kamala Harris. He says, the vice president has been briefed and is closely monitoring Hezbollah's horrific attack on a soccer field in Majdal Shams in northern Israel yesterday, which killed a number of children and teenagers. She condemns this horrific attack and mourns for all those killed and wounded. So basically exactly the same hawkish message as Joe Biden, with not much respect for international law. As you explained earlier, Golan Heights has only been considered northern Israel in the United States because Trump sort of just called it that. They're the only country in the world really that does recognize it as that. I mean, there has been, I suppose, there's a bit of a wave of enthusiasm around Kamala Harris, I think, because everyone was so depressed before she entered the race. What's your take on what she would be like were she to win the presidential election this November? And how do you think the Israelis are thinking about the possibility of a President Harris?
It's a big question and a lot to be said on this. Let me first start off by saying that I've had the opportunity to engage extensively with Phil over the years, not during the last couple of years when he's been in the White House in the vice president's office, but quite extensively when he was in the Obama White House. And he left that White House and he documented it through the books that he wrote, rather humbled, I would argue, in terms of what American military power actually can achieve. And he wrote some excellent pieces, quite critical of these grandiose American designs to do regime change or to transform the region, etc. So I think that is an experience that he left the Obama White House with. I can only imagine how much he must have been reinforced seeing what's been going on in Gaza for the last 10 months. But in terms of what Kamala Harris would or wouldn't do, there's been a lot of, I think, accurate criticism of saying that much of what she has said so far is only at the rhetorical level. I think that is correct. However, if there is to be any substantive shift in policy, it will be preceded by a rhetorical shift. If you take a look at her body language, how she dealt with Netanyahu when he was here, as well as what she said during that 5-10 minute speech she gave after their meeting, I think it went beyond rhetoric. She pointed out early on, of course, that how Israel defends itself matters, meaning that she's pointing towards international law, that it has to be in compliance with it. But perhaps most important, the Biden administration has kept on insisting that the reason why there isn't a ceasefire is because of Hamas. In reality, everybody knows that it's Netanyahu who is the problem. The Israelis write about it openly in their own media. Soldiers are leaving the military in Israel after realizing that Netanyahu is consistently sabotaging hostage deal talks, how he's been leaking intelligence strategically in order to collapse those talks. But the Biden administration strategy was to privately criticize Netanyahu, but publicly blame Hamas. Look at what Kamala Harris did. She actually looked at him and said that she had told him, clinch the deal, which suggests that the ball is in his court. He's the one who's not clinching the deal. That is not just a rhetorical shift. That is at least bordering on a substance shift, a very important one compared to where the Biden administration stands. Is it enough? In my view, absolutely not. But if you wanted to see some sort of a change in substance, it will be preceded by rhetorical shift. We have now seen that rhetorical shift. In some ways, I think has gone beyond what I expected. Then you have the statement by Phil in regards to what happened in the Golan Heights. Different ways of interpreting it. I would say that one potential explanation for this is that the Kamala Harris administration, or that they have actually been much, much harsher with the Israelis behind the scenes. This has generated a lot of enthusiasm in certain quarters in Washington. Some criticism, of course. This is either a way to balance that out or to give themselves cover. They're publicly siding with Israel, privately putting more pressure. This may be the case. This may not be the case. We don't know for certain yet. I certainly thought personally that it was discouraging to see them repeat this line that this is northern Israel. That is just factually incorrect. That's a violation of international law. It certainly doesn't support the US's claim of standing behind international law in Ukraine. And also this quickness of putting the blame at Hezbollah's feet, which may be true, but we don't know. And given how difficult it has been for this White House to figure out what is happening in Gaza every time there's a massacre, and saying that they don't want to jump to conclusion, they want to see an independent investigation. This time they only needed 12 hours to blame Hezbollah. That's certainly discouraging, but I wouldn't say that this is necessarily an indication of exactly the direction that the Kamala Harris administration potentially would go. And I think we've seen some mixed messages, and some of those messages have actually been quite encouraging.
Let's talk about, I suppose, what this uncertainty means for Israel and Gaza and potentially the Lebanese from now until November, because I would imagine that sort of, Netanyahu is thinking, what should I try and do before November? What should I wait to do until after November? Because I imagine, if Donald Trump wins the presidential election, then one would imagine that Netanyahu would have a lot more free reign there. I can't imagine sort of Donald Trump even giving any sort of intimation that he cares about international law. And as you've just described there, if Harris comes in, maybe not a radical change, but potentially some shifts. So with that, this is a difficult question, but if you were Netanyahu and you want a war with Lebanon, would you do it now or would you wait until after the presidential election? And do you think that is playing into sort of his reasoning here?
I think it's absolutely playing into his reasoning, and that's why this is actually quite fascinating, because the Israelis were very quick, of course, to blame Hezbollah, which is not a surprise. But then the question is, why hasn't it taken so long for them to lodge a war? It's been about 3 or so days now. And it makes me wonder as to whether there is some nervousness in the Netanyahu camp right now, precisely because of the shifts that are taking place in Washington. One, I think they were quite startled to see that the change in tone and the change in body language, and I assume the change in substance in the conversation they had with Kamala Harris. And secondly, 2-3 weeks ago, I think most of them believed that a Trump presidency was all but certain. And now I think it's much, much more of an uncertainty of who will be the next president. This, I think, gives the Israelis a lot of pause, because if it was a clear-cut situation, this was the perfect opportunity, almost too perfect, which is, raising some question marks as to who was actually behind this, but a perfect opportunity to be able to force on the United States a second bear hug, say that they were attacked, now they're responding, and the United States has to stand by Israel when it is responding and defending itself. That would be the narrative and the talking points. This was a great opportunity. So far, it hasn't happened. One has to wonder why that is the case.
Let's move on to some developments in Gaza, because while Israel's military sets its sight It sets its sights north to Lebanon. It's continued its attack on Gaza. 3 Israeli missiles have reportedly hit the Khadija school in Deir al-Balah, central Gaza. Israel says the strike was aimed at a Hamas command center inside the school where thousands of Palestinians were sheltering. At least 30 Palestinians were killed in the blasts and over 100 were injured. Most of the victims were women and children. According to a CNN report, one of those killed was a young boy who medics tried to save in the nearby Al-Aqsa hospital. He died with the word unidentified written across his stomach. In the south of Gaza, Israeli soldiers have also blown up Rafah's water reservoir, which serves more than 1 million Palestinians. In a region where clean water is scarce and where polio has been discovered in wastewater, the effects of destroying one of the few sources of water will be devastating. A soldier involved in the explosion celebrated by posting footage of the explosion to social media. He said it was, quote, in honor of Shabbat. But it seems this was one monstrosity too far or too public for the IDF's top brass, especially as some Western allies now appear to be changing tack on unconditional support for Israel. IDF officials have told Haaretz that the demolition was likely to be in breach of international law, and they say that while army commanders gave the order to blow up the reservoir, they did so without permission from senior officers. Sorry, we blew up their reservoir. You know, it's sort of, we didn't give permission to the commanders to do. Blowing up a reservoir isn't, often when you have a situation whereby, you say, oh, there was someone below us who reacted in a way which wasn't authorized. You say they did that under massive pressure. They thought the person was a threat, so they shot at them. They thought they were being shot at. It was actually just, a car engine making a bang, and so they shot. Generally, these excuses are ridiculous, but they can be at least coherent, even if they're wrong. They might be fake, right? But you can see how it would happen. How can you possibly have reacted sort of in the moment and blown up a reservoir? That was premeditated. Now, the amount of premeditation you need to blow up a reservoir, I find it difficult to believe that would have been done without some kind of acknowledgement, consent from those at the highest levels. So I don't believe this. I feel like this was put out on social media. It's actually put to music, that picture of the reservoir being blown up. The IDF top brass say, oh, actually, this is a bit embarrassing. Let's throw someone under the bus. People love saying, keep politics out of sport. But it seems with some people, you can't, even if you're just discussing their team's performance at the Olympics. That's what one young football fan in Paris found out this weekend.
It was a good game. I thought in the beginning Israel was better, but now Mali is is destroying them, I think. Israel is not bad. Israel is not bad, but I think Mali is going to destroy them today. No, I'm just talking about football. I'm just talking about football.
Mali the best, no politic here. Okay?
Free Palestine! Free Palestine! Free Palestine! Free Palestine!
Thank you. Les voulez sortir, c'est des enculés. Comment on dit enculés? Contre le culo.
Now, this has gone viral as an example of how Israel's sort of, overly aggressive PR campaigns often backfire. That was a guy who was just talking about the football, saying, Israel played okay, but Mali played better. Then you get an incredibly obnoxious Zionist coming forward saying, no politics. I'm talking about football. I'm talking about politics. I'm talking about football. No politics. But then he's like, fuck it then. I'll say it. Free Palestine. Free Palestine. Helena, everyone is loving that football fan. But do you think there was a wider message there?
Well, I think it just comes down to the kind of the victim mentality that you get from a lot of people in Israel. Oh, somebody's discussing my country. Well, it must be about all of these bad things that we keep doing. No, leave the politics. I'm like, mate, if you're so worried, right? If you're so worried about the way in which people are viewing your country so that you can literally interpret somebody who's just discussing something completely innocuous like the performance of your football team and immediately interpret it as some grand attack on your nation politically and saying, no politics. I think that's a you problem that you've got there, mate. I think that's your problem, right? If you're sick of other people discussing your politics in situations outside of that, maybe you should be the one looking inwardly at your own government and your own government's faults and the policies that they are engaging in that is allowing your country to become an international pariah. Because deep down, right? Deep down, if you can read into these innocuous comments, right? They talk about, they must be talking about us bad. Well, then you must know that you're also an international pariah. Unless you genuinely believe, or possibly might do, the whole community is out to get you. Israel's done nothing wrong, nothing wrong. The politics, they're divisive, but we were completely in the right here, and we've been unfairly demonized on international stage. Then, like, I'm sorry, like, again, if people are angry with you, that's for a genuine reason. And then on the flip side of that, on top of that, the belligerence that you continually see from Israel defenders, both on and offline, the continual defense saying, well, you can't always make everything about Israel political, all this BDS stuff, it's trying to make non-political things political. And then somebody who's in earshot of this, who actually genuinely did want to make things non-political, gets so irritated with your continued insistence to defend your country, even when they do the most kind of heinous crimes imaginable. Then they just go like, oh, fuck it. All right, okay, right. You want to make this about politics? You want to make this about politics? I'll make it about politics. Free Palestine. We're all thinking it, right? Clearly, there's a graph that was put out by YouGov today around sympathies with the Palestinian cause versus Israel, and talking about war crimes and Netanyahu ICC arrest warrants, and showing them literally every single country that they were surveyed in YouGov polling across Europe and in the West more broadly, all of them, the sympathies for Palestinians have massively increased since October the 7th, and their sympathy with Israel has massively dropped. The USA is a slight outlier in this, but even in countries which have always been broad allies of Israel, such as, for example, the UK, France, and even in Germany, the sympathies have massively dropped off. And I'm like, yeah, like, turns out if you do all of these things that make people dislike you, people will dislike you. And then on top of that, going up to somebody and saying, no, how dare you criticize it? Just leave politics out of this. I'm like, nah, they're just going to shout Free Palestine now, because that is the plurality opinion across the world now. Both East and West are both united now in thinking Free Palestine, really and truly, across demographics just outside of the United States, and a couple of island nations who keep voting in favor of Israel in UN votes. That's how isolated they are now.
It's amazing as well, isn't it? Because it's actually such an innocuous phrase, Free Palestine. It triggers people so much. Free Palestine! We can't have a free Palestine. It's like, well, if a free Palestine upsets you so much, maybe that's also a you problem. Thank you, Helena, for joining me tonight. A pleasure as always.
Absolutely. Well, very much so a pleasure. And take care. Hope everyone has a great evening.
And thank you, everyone, for watching this evening. We'll be back tomorrow from 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.